The afterglow of Austerlitz was ruined almost immediately by news of a financial crisis back in France. It must be stressed that at this point the crisis was financial only rather than economic in a general sense. A run on the banks had been triggered by the discovery that millions of government bonds had disappeared from the treasury, bringing ruin to thousands of investors. The hubbub only subsided when the emperor returned to France at the end of January R806. After thorough investigation, he suspended the minister of the treasury, Barbe Marbois, on suspicion of embezzlement. Until September R806, Napoleon remained in Paris, dealing with a plethora of vexatious domestic affairs and disputes involving the Marshallate. One of the first cases might have warned him that Naples was always going to be a thorn in his side. Gouvion St-Cyr was a highly talented general, uncorrupt, with a lifelong hatred of Freemasonry, and an early protégé of Dessaix's. A brilliant organizer, he had recommended himself to Napoleon by his dislike of Jourdan and Moreau. He was on the shortlist of possible marshals in R804, but ruined his chances by refusing to sign a proclamation which congratulated Bonaparte on becoming emperor. In Naples he clashed spectacularly with Murat and Messina, and in disgust with Messina resigned in R806 and left for Paris in January R806. Napoleon convinced him to return only by threatening him with a firing squad for desertion if he did not. The St-Cyr affair simply illustrated a general proposition: Napoleon's lieutenants rarely served him well. The emperor set up an imperial university under the poet Louis de Fontaine's, supposedly a body directing education throughout France. The idea was that the university would monopolize teaching and the Grand Master of the imperial university would be assisted by a council and a bureau of educational inspectors, but Fontaine subverted the intention of creating an imperial elite by stuffing the universities and lycées with ultramontane Catholics, thus producing the bizarre result that education under Bonaparte contained as much piety and religious indoctrination as under the ancient regime. The fiasco over the Imperial University was part of a more general power struggle with the Catholic Church. Napoleon suspected the hand of the Pope behind the riots in Parma, which were bloodily suppressed at the beginning of R806. Pius VII irritated him by refusing to annul Jerome's American marriage, by declining to recognize Joseph as King of Naples, and by his political neutrality. During the struggle with the Third Coalition, the Pope refused to garrison Ancona, which could have allowed the British to turn his flank in Italy. When Napoleon had defeated the Third Coalition, he turned to settle accounts with the papacy, complaining that Rome was a hotbed of British espionage and insisting that the Pope set his face against England. There should be a general treaty with Naples for the defense of Italy, and the immediate closure of all papal ports to British trade. When the Pope demurred, the issue became one of credibility. Napoleon wrote angrily to Cardinal Fesch, "For the Pope I am Charlemagne. I therefore expect to be treated from this point of view. I shall change nothing in appearance if they behave well, otherwise I shall reduce the Pope to be merely Bishop of Rome." To Pius himself Napoleon wrote with a litany of complaints and reprimands, "Your Holiness is sovereign of Rome, but I am its emperor. All my enemies must be those of your Holiness." The Pope replied curtly, "There is no emperor of Rome." For the time being Napoleon had more pressing concerns, but he vowed that when Europe was more settled he would have a final reckoning of accounts with the Vicar of Christ. To show his contempt for the papacy, the emperor had his tame nuncio Cardinal Caprara approve the publication of a new French catechism, which ordained absolute loyalty to the emperor on all French Catholics. In return for the outright purchase in his own name of his palace in Bologna, Caprara was happy to do Napoleon's bidding. The new catechism seemed at first merely to stress the age-old duty of Catholics to obey temporal rulers, but in the 7th lesson of the document the emperor was mentioned by name. "We in particular owe to Napoleon I, our emperor, love, respect, obedience, loyalty, military service, the dues laid down for the conservation and defense of the empire and of its throne. We also owe him fervent prayers for his safety and for the temporal and spiritual prosperity of the state." Why do we owe all these duties towards our emperor? Firstly, because God, plentifully bestowing gifts upon our emperor, whether for peace or for war, has made him the minister of his power and his image upon earth. Are there not particular reasons which should attach us more closely to Napoleon I, our emperor? Yes, because it is he whom God has sustained, in difficult circumstances, so that he might re-establish public worship and the holy faith of our fathers, and that he might be their protector. He has restored and maintained public order by his profound and active wisdom. He defends the state with his powerful arm. He has become the anointed of the Lord by the consecration he has received from the sovereign pontiff, head of the universal church. What must one think of those who should fail in their duty to our emperor? According to the Apostle Paul, they would resist the established order of God himself, and would render themselves worthy of eternal damnation. hubris after Austerlitz, or the iron of despotism entering his soul. Certainly in our 806 there are many pointers to a new, harsher Napoleon, who would brook no opposition and whose attitude to dissent anticipated the dictatorships of the 20th century. From Paris he wrote to Murat, now Grand Duke of Berg, I am astonished that the notables of Cleves have refused to swear allegiance to you. Let them take the oath within 24 hours or have them arrested, bring them to trial, and confiscate their possessions. His attitude to Hesse was even more draconian. There was an insignificant, almost token revolt there while it was under military rule before being absorbed in a new kingdom of Westphalia. The general in command considered that a single exemplary execution was enough to assert French credibility, but Napoleon insisted that the village where the revolt started be burnt to the ground and 30 ringleaders shot in terrorem. Vihen the general protested. Napoleon raised the number to 60 and finally 200. As Talleyrand had predicted, for the emperor to establish the Confederation of the Rhine and make himself arbiter of Germany was to embroil himself in a never-ending skein of problems and crises. It is extraordinary to follow the stages whereby the emperor converted neutral Prussia into an enemy by the end of the year. Frederick William III was the least hostilely disposed of all European monarchs towards Bonaparte. He disliked the Bourbons, was in no way alarmed by Napoleon as first consul, and wanted only to steer clear of trouble and maintain the neutrality to which Prussia had adhered since 795, yet Napoleon served him up affront after affront. In our 805 the Grand Army blatantly violated the neutrality of the Prussian territory of Ansbach in violation of a promise France had just made to Berlin. Had the Allies won at Austerlitz, Prussia would certainly have entered the war on their side. After Austerlitz, Prussia was left out on a limb. Napoleon, knowing the contingency plans Frederick William had made to mobilize his troops, decided to cow him. He proposed peace terms to Berlin on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. Prussia was to lose territories which would be reconstituted as duchies for Berthier and the Marshals. All Prussia's treaties were to be replaced by an exclusive accord with France, and Prussia was to pledge itself to take any and every economic measure against England that Napoleon proposed. As a douceur, Prussia would receive Hanover. Frederick William meekly accepted, making himself a laughing-stock in Europe. Then came the twin blows of the Confederation of the Rhine and the end of the Holy Roman Empire. This was the moment Napoleon should have adopted Talleyrand's plan for a Paris-Vienna axis, to dominate Europe and keep out Russia. The time was propitious, for Archduke Charles, restored to favor, was promoting a policy of military expansion in the east at the expense of Turkey, leaving Germany and Italy in Bonaparte's sphere of influence. But the emperor believed in humiliating those he had defeated, not conciliating them. Having ensured by his contumacious behavior that the spirit of revanchisme would live on in Austria, he then proceeded to alienate Prussia by 3 separate actions of gross insensitivity. First, by insisting that Prussia join his proposed economic blockade of England, he forced her into war with Britain. 700 German ships were at once impounded in British ports and ruin stared the mercantile classes in the face. Secondly, he struck out vigorously at inchoate signs of German nationalism. He ordered Berthier to raid into neutral territory to seize a subversive Prussian bookseller named Palm. In a sordid rerun of the Dingian affair, Palm was kidnapped and executed by firing squad for disseminating nationalist tracts prejudicial to the interests of the French Empire. Thirdly, Napoleon made a final attempt to secure terms with Britain by offering to let her have Hanover back. The offer was brusquely snubbed, but the proposal soon leaked, and infuriated the Prussians, who realized that Napoleon had been quite prepared to sell them down the river. Napoleon's ham-fisted attempts at personal diplomacy, as usual, ended up by securing the worst of both worlds, hatred and contempt from both Britain and Prussia. Alarmed at the way the prestige of nation and army were being impaired by Frederick William's unwillingness to stand up to Bonaparte, a war party led by the formidable Queen Louise gained the upper hand in Berlin and forced the reluctant king to a declaration of war. The fiasco over Hanover had been an insult too far. Mobilization began on the 9th of August, and on the 26th of August came the Prussian ultimatum. Napoleon was to take his troops back across the Rhine by the 8th of October or the two nations would be at war. Yet the decision for war was a disastrous one. Prussia was now fighting alone when a year ago she would have been in well-nigh invincible combination with Austria and Russia. Prussia, with an army ossified in the methods of Frederick the Great, was something of a museum piece, bedeviled by old and useless generals, excessive factionalism and negligible staff work. And this was the force that would be taking on Napoleon's Grand Army, now at the very peak of its power in terms of numbers, equipment, efficiency and morale. There was something comical too about the way the Prussian leadership dithered about their intentions, unable to decide between 3 different strategies. They compounded their error by not waiting for the Russians, who resumed hostilities with France once they heard of the Prussian ultimatum. So spectacular was Prussian incompetence that Napoleon spent nearly a month devising counter-strategies on the assumption Berlin must have some masterplan up its sleeve. Finally convinced that he confronted merely bumbledom and that Austria would not intervene, Napoleon set out for Mainz on the 24th of September, accompanied by Josephine and Talleyrand. His aim was to destroy the Prussians before the Russians could arrive. To bring the enemy to battle, he decided on a drive for Berlin, first concentrating the army in the Bamberg-Bayreuth area, then swinging north through the Franconia forest towards Leipzig and Dresden, with the Prussian capital always in his sights. He whipped up battle frenzy in his troops by telling them that they had already been recalled to victory festivities in Paris when Prussian treachery caused a change of plan. Adopting his usual principles, Napoleon tried to foresee the unforeseeable and anticipate the unexpected. He put Brune on full alert at Boulogne against a possible British descent on the Channel coast, and put Eugene de Beauharnais' army of Italy on a war footing just in case Austria was tempted to enter the war. The final Prussian ultimatum, delivered on the 2nd of October, reached the French just 24 hours before the deadline expired and allowed Bonaparte to present the Prussians to French public opinion as warmongers. Then he made final preparations. The Prussians seemed to be offending every canon of warfare by menacing Bavaria with 3 separate armies that could be caught and destroyed piecemeal. The Duke of Brunswick and Frederick William commanded 60,000 Prussians, another mixed force of S0000 Prussians and Saxons were under the Prince of Hohenlohe, and a third force of 30,000 was under Riekel. Napoleon planned to intercept the armies before they could unite. He began crossing the Franconian forest on the 2nd of October with a 180,000-strong army drawn up in a square formation, ready to deal with an enemy attack from any direction. By the 8th of October, Napoleon was expecting an engagement on the Elbe near Leipzig. But as he emerged from the forest and began to move across Saxony towards Leipzig, intelligence reached him that the main Prussian army was at Erfurt, to the west. Mentally calculating march times, he estimated that he would be fighting a battle on the 1/6 and faced his army round towards the River Saale. On the 13th of October, Lannes, commanding the advance guard, reported that the Prussians were present in strength at Jena on the Saale. During the night of 1/3 the 14th of October, Napoleon ordered 120,000 of his men to converge on Jena, while I and 3 corps under, respectively, Bernadotte and Devout, were to advance north to Auerstedt to cut off the Prussian retreat to the Elbe. Once again Bernadotte elected not to obey his orders, peeled away from Devout and marched to Dornberg. But at Jena confusion was compounding uncertainty as the main Prussian army streamed away northwards, leaving Hohenlohe at Jena to cover the retreat. Meanwhile Napoleon, expecting to encounter the main enemy army, caught up with Lannes on the evening of the 1/3 and next morning got S0000 men onto the projected battlefield, with 70,000 more coming up fast. Around 6 a.m. Lannes, Soult and Augereau began by driving off the Prussian vanguard and enlarging the bridgehead on the west bank of the Saale. There was then a short pause to allow new formations to come up. Once Ney's VI Corps arrived, Napoleon sent him and Lannes in a 2-corps attack on the Prussians. An outnumbered Hohenlohe fought back fiercely and called up reinforcements. The headstrong Ney attacked furiously but allowed himself to be cut off from Lannes and Augereau. Napoleon had to intervene in person with a massed artillery battery to rescue Ney. By midday Augereau and Soult were in their proper positions on the flanks. An hour's slaughter took place as the Prussian infantry, in an exposed position, was cut to pieces. Napoleon ordered a general advance at 1 p.m. The Prussians retreated and the retreat soon became a rout. By 3 p.m. the French had inflicted 25-0 casualties and sustained losses of S-0 themselves. Although roughly equal in numbers of big guns, the two sides were otherwise ill-matched, for the French put 96,000 men onto the field against Hohenlohe and Riekel's 53,000. Napoleon was content, for he was sure that Devout and Bernadotte would have reached Apolda and cut off the retreat. But when he reached headquarters at dusk, he received the astonishing news that he had not after all been fighting the main enemy army. It fell to Devout to encounter that host, 10 miles away at Auerstedt. Incredibly, with just 27,000 men and 40 guns he routed the 63,000-strong army with 230 guns under Frederick William and the Duke of Brunswick. As Devout passed the Saale and the Cosen Pass beyond, he collided with Brunswick's flankers. The divisions of Vandam and Guden under Devout performed wonders as more and more Prussian infantry and cavalry rushed to the spot, but things might have gone hard with them if Brunswick had not been wounded, throwing the chain of command into confusion. Devout faced odds of 2-1, but he remained calm and defiant as the Prussians grew ever more hesitant. Finally, Frederick William panicked at the thought that he was opposed by Napoleon in person. At 4 p.m. he ordered a retreat, which also became a rout, for Devout counterattacked at the first sign of enemy withdrawal. Devout's astonishing victory at Auerstedt was harder won than the Emperor's at Jena. He killed I,000 Prussians and took 7,000 prisoners, while sustaining losses of 7,700 in dead and wounded himself. Napoleon at first found it difficult to acknowledge that he had made such a signal error, and played this down in his bulletins. Privately, he gave Devout full credit for his marvelous feat but showed some slight signs of jealousy by not giving him the dukedom of Auerstadt until some years later. But if he felt some negative emotion towards Devout, this was nothing to the anger he displayed towards Bernadotte. Devout informed him that he had repeatedly sent for help to Bernadotte during the thick of the battle, but the Gascon had ignored him. Bernadotte, indeed, discovered the trick which at least one other third-rate marshal would later emulate, of not being present at either battle. If Bernadotte had reached the Apolda 3 hours earlier, as he was supposed to, he would have trapped the fugitives from the field of Jena, and a canny-like annihilation would have resulted. Even as it was, Jena-Auerstadt was a great victory. Speculation was rife in the army that this time Bernadotte had overreached himself, and would surely be court-martialed. Not a single man in his corps had been in action, even though the Grand Army had just fought 2 grueling battles. The cause had to be either incompetence or malice. The most likely explanation is deliberate sabotage by Bernadotte, arising from his insane jealousy of Bonaparte. Napoleon certainly thought so and signed an order for his court-martial, to the great satisfaction of Devout. Then, to general consternation, he tore it up. How could his marshals know that the emperor was still thinking of Désiré Clary? Bernadotte was given one last chance to retrieve his reputation. He, Lannes and Murat pursued the fleeing Prussians, and this time the Gascon was on his mettle. Blücher, with 22,000 troops, headed for Lübeck, hoping to ship out for England with his men. But Bernadotte, in an unwontedly energetic pursuit, caught up with him at the Baltic. Surrounded by Bernadotte and Soult, Blücher had no choice but to surrender. The French meanwhile won another victory at Halle and crossed the Elbe. There was a slight delay while gross indiscipline among drunken, marauding French troops was sorted out, but finally the Grand Army entered Berlin on the 25th of October. In 33 days Napoleon had inflicted SS 0 casualties, forced the surrender of another 40,000 troops and taken 2,000 cannon. He had spent a lot of the campaign groping in the dark, but finally the combination of his famous intuition and his mathematical brain resulted in another memorable victory. It was a good result for the Grand Army too, for if Ney and Bernadotte had lost caste, Devout and Lannes had performed brilliantly. The terms dictated by Napoleon after Jena were harsh. Prussia was to cede all territory between the Rhine and the Elbe, which meant the end for the Duke of Brunswick, the Prince of Orange and the Elector of Hesse-Kassel. A huge indemnity of 59,425,000 francs was levied, and Prussia was in effect turned into a French satellite. Napoleon pardoned Saxony on condition she joined the Confederation of the Rhine, along with Saxe-Weimar, Gotha, Meiningen, Hildburghausen and Coburg. Even though the army was shattered, Rs 0000 prisoners of war were in French hands, and 3/4 of Prussia was occupied. Queen Louise announced that the struggle would go on and put herself at the head of Prussian partisans, who fled to the east to join the Russians. To Napoleon's consternation, he realized that the great victory of Jena-Auerstadt was not going to be a second Austerlitz and provide a knockout blow. To Josephine, whom he had left in Mainz when he began campaigning, the emperor wrote with words of complaint about the Prussian queen. How unhappy are those princes who permit their wives to interfere in affairs of state. Josephine construed this as an attack on women in general and wrote back protestingly. Napoleon endeavored to put her right. You seem displeased by my speaking ill of women. It is true that I detest scheming women. I am accustomed to ones who are gentle, sweet and captivating. It is your fault, it is you who have spoiled me for the others. The tenor of this letter was of a piece with all his missives to Josephine that winter. He wrote tenderly, sometimes twice a day, invariably ending with the formulaic I love and embrace you or I love and desire you. The prevailing tone was very much that of an old married couple, with the emperor complaining that he was putting on weight even though he rode up to 70 miles a day on horseback. When Napoleon had written during the Italian campaign that he desired Josephine, it was literally true. Now the sentiment was a mere formal expression of regard, for the emperor was used to satisfying his carnal appetites elsewhere. One such occasion was on the road to Berlin, on the 23rd of October, when he took refuge from a hailstorm in a hunting lodge and dallied with the young widow of an officer from the Egyptian campaign. On the 27th of October he entered Berlin, having spent the previous night at Sanssouci in Potsdam, where he visited the tomb of his idol Frederick the Great. Hearing that Mortier had successfully taken the port of Danzig, he wrote that he would be leaving for Poland in a few days. He was beginning to toy with the idea of a permanent occupation of the territory between the Oder and the Vistula, and to this end asked Fouch to send him Tadeusz Kosciuszko and the other leaders of the Polish independence movement. On the 8th of November Magdeburg capitulated and Murat wrote in triumph, "Sire, the war is over owing to the lack of combatants." But Murat was jumping the gun. Paradoxically, after a great military triumph Napoleon was on the defensive. As he saw it, a Russian counter-offensive could coincide with a British landing somewhere in Europe, and meanwhile the gold of London might have persuaded Austria to rise on his southern flank. Worst of all was the news from Paris, where the French people had greeted Austerlitz with joy. They reacted to news of Jena with gloom. They wanted peace, not a protracted struggle with Russia. But Napoleon refused to bow to public opinion. When the Senate sent a deputation to Berlin to urge him to make peace, he received it coldly and told the senators he would make peace only when Russia joined him in the great global fight against England. He took vigorous action to make sure he retained the initiative. A judicious mixture of stick and carrot kept Austria quiet, so that the potential threat from the south never materialized during the 1807 campaign. He struck at England by announcing an economic blockade in his Berlin decree of the 21st of November 1806, and he headed off trouble in the army by ordering a cash bonus, doubling the commissariat supply, and issuing each soldier with a brand new set of clothes and several pairs of shoes. The more hard-headed and obdurate he was in military and political affairs, the more philosophical and detached from the world he seemed in his letters to Josephine. In a classic of compensation he wrote to her, "Everything in this world must come to an end, wit, sentiment, the sun itself, but that which has no end is the happiness I have found with you, in the unending goodness and sweetness of my Josephine." Napoleon's analysis of the Russian army was that it was a very mixed bag. The infantry was usually poorly armed, trained and equipped, consisting of uneducated and unpaid peasantry, but it could fight with great stubbornness when cornered. If the rank and file were tough and brave, the officers were of very poor quality, often military dilettantes or men whose only professionalism was in gambling, and there were few generals of any caliber. The Russian army was hidebound by bureaucracy and suffocated by red tape, but could still not supply its fighting men adequately. On the other hand, its artillery was excellent in both quantity and quality, and the cavalry, especially the Cossacks, were as good as the French, if not better. Napoleon was under no illusions about the difficulty of the coming campaign. The one card he could play was to win over Polish support by declaring for an independent Poland. He let it be known that he would make such a proclamation if the Polish leaders would put 40,000 good soldiers in the field. Meanwhile, he sent Duroc on a mission to browbeat or cajole the Prussians into signing the proposed peace treaty. He began to proceed slowly through Poland. When the deputies of Poznan asked him if he would declare Polish independence, he gave an evasive reply, stalling until he heard from Duroc. A week later he heard from Duroc that his mission had failed, but still there was no declaration. The emperor finally revealed his hand to Murat on the 6th of December when he told his brother-in-law that he would not make such a proclamation until he was sure the Poles were prepared to do the hard work to sustain it. That meant 40,000 well-trained and organized men, fully armed, led by a mounted nobility ready to sacrifice their lives in battle instead of conspiring in coffee houses. Predictably, the leaders of the Polish independence movement were dismayed. Kosciuszko noted bitterly, "He will not reconstitute Poland, he thinks only of himself and he is a despot. His only aim is personal ambition." Kosciuszko was right. In his heart the emperor had nothing but contempt for Polish national aspirations, though he was prepared to pose as the deliverer of the Polish nation to win recruits for his armies. Having convinced himself there was nothing substantial to hope for from the Poles, Napoleon began intriguing with the Turks. On December he wrote to Selim III, Sultan of the Sublime Porte, suggesting that this was the moment to strike against Islam's ancient enemy, and so restore the former splendor of the Ottoman Empire. This must be read as part of a continuing obsession with turning the Russian flank, manifest in the letters in this period from the emperor to his marshals, and the frustration he felt, openly admitted in correspondence with Talleyrand, that the Russians were avoiding a battle. There is some anxiety just below the surface in some of his billets due to Josephine, especially one on December when he writes, "It's raining but I'm all right. I love you and desire you. These nights are long, all alone." To forestall the Russians, Napoleon decided to occupy Russia, and sent instructions to Devout to meet him there with his corps. The Russian general Bennigsen, playing Fabius to the emperor's Hannibal, decided not to oppose the French invasion of Poland and withdrew his army to the banks of the Vistula. The prize for entering Warsaw first went, as such prizes usually did, to the dashing Murat. But Napoleon was not yet finished with the Russians. In December he tried to cut the Russian communications by getting behind them to the river Nero. As a first step he sent forces to seize the town of Poltusk, but this was exactly where the Russian army had retreated to, so that the French crossings of the Nere River were hotly contested. A running battle developed from the 22nd of December onwards, culminating in an indecisive battle at Poltusk on the 26th of December, which Napoleon was able to write up in his bulletins as a victory since the Russians withdrew and allowed the French to occupy the town. The battle petered out mainly because the Russian commander Bennigsen decided to avoid a slugging match, and because Devout, unwantedly off form, failed to support Lannes at the vital moment. Following another indecisive battle on the 26th of December between Devout and Augereau and Galitzin and Doktorov, the Russians withdrew to Rozhen. Violently adverse weather forced Napoleon to break off pursuit and take the Grand Army into winter quarters. He wrote to Cambyses on the 29th of December, "I believe the campaign is over. The enemy has put the steps between us." On the 19th of December Napoleon arrived in Warsaw. There was much to ponder. In his heart he knew the Nair campaign had not gone well. He had failed to keep his corps within supporting distance of each other and thus could not bring the enemy to a decisive action. True, rapidity of maneuver was scarcely possible on fields that had become quagmires of mud, but the more worrying sign was gross indiscipline and desertion in the Grand Army itself, with an astonishing 40% rate of absenteeism by the end of the year. But at least one of the emperor's gambles had paid off. Against the odds, Selim III declared war on Russia in December and followed it with a similar declaration against England in January. Encouraged by this, Napoleon, always lured by the East, began trying to encourage Persia to join in hostilities against Russia. Meanwhile, he faced the task of building up virtually a new army. Morale in the old Grand Army was rock bottom, for serving with the emperor seemed like dealing with the Hydra's heads. Each victory simply entailed yet another campaign. The actual physical conditions of marching and fighting in Poland were the worst yet encountered, with dreadful roads that disintegrated into mud paths when rain and snow fell. Indiscipline, desertion and looting were the inevitable result. One of the emperor's first tasks in Warsaw was to work out how he could get his army into shape for a possible spring campaign against the Russians. He began by calling up the 1807 intake of conscripts a year early and followed up by a recruiting drive in Switzerland and Holland aimed at raising 35,000 men. Always allowing political considerations to be overridden by military necessities, he started bleeding Germany dry of money. He mulcted the conquered territories of 720 million francs, including 160 millions from Prussia. Hamburg bore a heavy toll. Confiscated British assets in the Baltic ports increased the total. Not content with uplifting money, Napoleon imposed requisitions in kind, especially for military materials such as 600,000 pairs of shoes. Coming on top of the Berlin decrees, these measures scarcely made the emperor a popular man in Germany. Napoleon did what he often did when confronted by titanic problems. He made a show of indifference and masked his anxieties by a riotous display of conspicuous consumption. Savary recalled in his memoirs that January 807 in Warsaw was a virtually non-stop festival of concerts, balls, parties, fetes and other spectacles. To Josephine the emperor wrote offhandedly, "I'm well. It's bad weather. I love you with all my heart." Josephine, still in Mainz, had been plaguing him to let her join him, but Napoleon stressed that there was no point while his future plans were so uncertain. In a notably prophetic dream she saw Napoleon with a woman with whom he was in love. In what we may now see as dramatic irony, Napoleon replied as follows, "You say that your dream does not make you jealous. I think therefore that you are jealous and I am delighted. In any case you are wrong. In these frozen Polish wastes one is not likely to think of beautiful women. There is only one woman for me. Do you know her? I could paint her portrait for you but it would make you conceited. The winter nights are long, all alone." Only days after writing these words Napoleon met the woman who would be the second great love of his life. He had left Warsaw for a week on the 23rd of December 806 and was returning to the city on New Year's Eve in a 6-horse carriage. At Brony, the last post relay before Warsaw, as thick snow fell, the emperor's carriage was mobbed by enthusiastic Poles, believing him to be the messiah of Polish independence. What appeared to be a beautiful, blonde-haired peasant girl came up to the carriage and asked Duroc to present her to the emperor. Napoleon was struck by her looks, her modesty, her ability to speak French and the simple adoration of a young woman overjoyed to see the man who had smitten Poland's 3 great historical oppressors, Russia, Austria and Prussia. He gave her one of the bouquets that had been thrown into his carriage when he lowered the window, and thought about her all the way to Warsaw. Once there, he told Duroc to spare no measures to find the beautiful peasant. On the 3rd of January Duroc told him the search had been successful. There was a problem, though. The beautiful peasant turned out to be Countess Marie Walewska, the 18-year-old wife of an elderly Polish nationalist. Though her husband was 77, she was supposed to have borne him a son. Further inquiries made the picture clearer. Marie had been married at 16 and had indeed borne a son to Walewski, the grand seigneur of his district, even though he had a grandson of 25. Marie herself had been strictly brought up, in the full piety of Polish Catholicism, and educated by a tutor who later became famous as the father of Frederick Chopin. Napoleon made plain to the Polish nationalists his desire for a liaison with Marie, and told them bluntly he would not be attending the ball they were giving in his honor unless the young countess was there. Count Welski, despite his age, did not take kindly to the prospect of being a cuckold, and at first refused to procure his wife for the French emperor, even though Prince Poniatowski argued that it would eventually redound to his prestige. But he was eventually browbeaten by a junta of leading Polish nationalists, who argued that Paris was always worth a mass. Marie, however, was not prepared to accept her husband's bidding in this matter and at first adamantly refused. She was appalled at what was being asked of her and thought it too high a price to pay for Poland. After all, what were the male patriots giving up for the cause? She later told how a deputation of patriots harangued her outside her bedroom door, then, when her husband admitted them to her boudoir, exhorted her to make this supreme sacrifice for the sake of Polish independence. After all, had not the biblical heroine Esther given herself to the Persian king Ahasuerus to win liberty for her nation? Marie responded with a kind of work to rule. She went to the ball dressed more like a nun than a great lady, swathed in tulle, wearing no jewelry and with her ball dress deliberately high-necked. Napoleon said to her, "White on white is no way to dress, madam," an enigmatic statement sometimes read as the emperor's customary derogatory remark when a woman was wearing clothes that displeased him, and sometimes taken to mean that he had penetrated her motives in appearing thus. But the fact that he spoke to her at all alerted a court sensitive to the slightest nuance. Clearly this was the coming woman. Marie was surrounded by fawning flatterers. She refused to dance, but 2 officers who flirted with her incurred the emperor's displeasure, and were dispatched to distant wintry outposts. After the ball, Napoleon began the siege of her affections. He began with a letter: "I saw only you, I admired only you, I desired only you." A prompt answer to calm the impatient ardor of Anne-Marie was unimpressed, and told the waiting courier, "There is no answer." Napoleon continued to press his suit and wrote passionate letters daily which she ignored. He also sent her jewels in a red leather box which she threw on the floor contemptuously, exclaiming that the emperor must take her for a whore. He continued to bombard her with letters, including one which deserves a prize for its disingenuousness: "Come to me, all your hopes will be fulfilled. Your country will be dearer to me when you take pity on my poor heart. Whenever I have thought a thing impossible or difficult to obtain, I have desired it all the more. Nothing discourages me. I am accustomed to seeing my wishes met. Your resistance subjugates me. I want to force you, yes, force you to love me. Marie, I have brought back to life your country's name. I will do much more." Under virtual siege from the all-powerful French emperor while being constantly urged by the patriotic party, and even her own husband, to dispense with her absurd scruples, Marie finally cracked. She went to Napoleon's residence one night, but when he began caressing her she changed her mind, provoking an angry outburst from the emperor. He told her that if she resisted him, both she and her country would be ground under heel. He threw his watch onto the floor and ground it into pieces. What happened next appears to have been half rape, half seduction. On St. Helena, Napoleon said Marie put up merely token resistance, while many years later in her memoirs she claims she fainted clean away and awoke to find that he had had his way with her. At any rate, after the first act of sexual intercourse she burst into tears. Napoleon comforted her by vowing he would make good all his promises to her. Gradually Marie, against her better judgment, found herself falling in love with him, responding warmly to his attentiveness, charm, gentleness, for he could lay it on with a trowel when he had a mind to. For his part he found himself enraptured by a woman as never since Josephine. Like her, Marie was traditionally feminine, soft, gentle and unchallenging. But now he had the problem of Josephine to solve. Ever since Duroc first reported to him that he had found the mystery woman, Napoleon had been at pains to dissuade Josephine from traveling to Warsaw. Letters written on the 3rd, 7th and 8th of January all said the same thing. The roads were bad and the countryside unsafe, so the best course for the Empress was an immediate return to Paris. As the relationship with Marie moved towards consummation, he proved himself once more a Corsican master of duplicity. "Paris claims you. It is my wish. I would have liked to share the long winter nights with you here." By the end of January the tired phrases about long winter nights and impossible roads had become a meaningless litany. Contenting herself with a few jaundiced remarks about the military tasks ahead of her husband, she reluctantly commenced a long, slow journey back to Paris. Napoleon's Warsaw idyll with Marie Walewska was meanwhile interrupted by news that Bennigsen and the Russians had launched an offensive. What happened was that Ney had winkled the Russians out of their winter quarters by an unauthorized plundering expedition in the Polish Lakeland region, which he justified by pleading shortage of supplies. This hardened a resolve that had been forming in Bennigsen's mind for some time, that he would thrust towards the French left, break through on the Vistula and open a spring campaign that would drive the Grand Army back to the Oder.